I extend a warm welcome to Ms. Ann Shaftel, and I'd like to say a few words. You will see in the middle of this lecture that certain questions pop up, and those have been put in there deliberately. As you know, we have a lot of students who are now participating in the museology and conservation program of the CSMVS and other institutes. We had an exercise with these students and they came up with some really good questions. So we have inserted them into this talk and shared them with Ann Shaftel so that this makes it a more meaningful evening for all of us. Ann Shaftel's work is at the forefront of Thangka conservation. As you heard, her title is Conservation of Thangkas and the questions and concerns that arise from the conservation. Since 1970, she has worked in conservation of Buddhist art for governments, museums, universities, dharma centers, and monasteries, and is fellow of the International Institute for Conservation, fellow of the American Institute for Conservation, member of Canadian Association of Professional Conservators, ICOM, and ICOMOS. Her international monastery preservation project called Treasure, Caretaker, and Training, which has a website, www.treasurecaretaker.com, won the prestigious Digital Empowerment Foundation Chairman's Choice Award. Her lectures, seminars, research, and numerous publications continue to serve as valuable resources in museums and monasteries. Preservation of Buddhist Treasures resource, a free online resource written in response to preservation questions from monks and nuns, includes a comprehensive and richly illustrated section on Thangka preservation. Thangka preservation, as you will see as the evening progresses, is as complicated as the Thangka form itself, a complex composite art form spanning centuries and continents and still evolving. In this interactive talk titled Conservation of Thangkas, Ann Shaftel will address a few questions and concerns which arise when either a lay person or an expert thinks of Thangkas and their conservation. It will include important fundamental points of the Thangka forms, history, purpose, preservation, evolution, and the complexities of preservation of this sacred art form. She will cover literally the DNA of the Thangka. So welcome Ann Shaftel to the Museum Society of Bombay and our other co-hosts, the Xavier's College and our beloved CSMVS. And I now hand you over back to the tech team to start the lecture. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody. Hope you enjoy the evening. I'm sure you will.
Thank you so much, Feroza and Jason. I really appreciate this invitation. And I also would like to express my gratitude to my Buddhist teachers, to conservation colleagues and mentors, and to the funders who have enabled me to be able to work and concentrate on preservation of Buddhist art through 50 years' time. Thank you. I also welcome everyone who's here today with us for this Zoom, and to those who are taking the time to watch the video in the future. Thank you so much for joining us, and I welcome you. Thangka preservation, and this webinar is about your questions and your concerns. Thangka preservation is as complicated as the Thangka form itself, which is a complex composite art form spanning centuries and continents and still evolving. This event is based on your own Thangka questions and concerns and will include fundamental points of Thangka form, history, purpose, preservation and evolution, and the complexities of preservation of the sacred. So I actually have spent quite a bit of time putting step-by-step Thangka form information into this comprehensive Thangka webinar, and here's the link. If you have any further questions following this presentation, I welcome you to get in touch with me. Thank you. Summing up, Thangka conservation science. You want storage, handling, and display. If a Thangka is damaged, simply stabilize its condition. Never try to make a historic traditional Thangka treasure look as if it were painted today. Respect the evidence of traditional use of a sacred art form. Thangkas are not dirty and therefore cannot be cleaned. Blessing substances are part of the history of the Thangka, and there is no varnish layer. Often, severe cleaning, overall consolidation, and recreating missing iconography for a Thangka painting, usually for museums. Because you want it to appear clean and new is never successful, and you can create permanent change and damage. If you want a new-looking Thangka, have a new Thangka painted by a traditionally trained Thangka painter and the textile surrounds sewn by a traditionally trained tailor. They exist and they're waiting for you. Thangka is a sacred art form, but conservators work with cultural heritage treasures from diverse world religions. Discussion about sacred art is so interesting because sacred is a definition that is intangible, and yet we are dealing with tangible objects, things that are made of atoms and molecules. A big question for people on a very personal level and a professional level is, what defines something in a material object as being sacred? Is there a line up to where it's not sacred and then it becomes sacred? Or is it something in its physical makeup that makes it sacred? What kind of ceremony or whom can transform it to being sacred? Can something happen to an object during its history that make it either sacred or that erases its sacred qualities? A lot of these questions are addressed in Preservation of Buddhist Treasures resource. We wrote this in response, direct response to questions from monks and nuns and their community members. And it's illustrated with their questions and images from monasteries. It includes sections on text preservation, wall painting preservation, and emphasizes documentation. We teach documentation in workshops in a way that's completely confidential within each monastery, because the monks and nuns are doing the documentation themselves, and therefore they can keep all the information confidential. This is so important, and we teach a way to use their own smartphones. It's low-tech and effective. We emphasize video interviews of elders because elders hold a history of sacred objects. Safe storage. Emergency planning and disaster mitigation is so important. That's all included. And this talk and the resource is based on risk assessment for Thangkas, which we'll talk about. Risk assessment for Buddhist treasures, whether in monasteries or in your collection, includes water, pollution. We know about pests, especially monkeys, for example. Human choices. The pandemic is now a risk. Theft, earthquake, fire, temperature and relative humidity, and light. Risk assessment, you may think, is so scientific, but actually when we present it in our workshops, and we'll be using it today, every monk and nun has many examples of how these risks appear as threats to their own monastery treasures in their own monasteries. Very enthusiastic and practical. I love these workshops and working in monasteries. Thangka preservation is a huge section of our resource. It's going to be over 500 pages, and we're still working on it. Thangka is a complex composite object. I like to call them Thangka sculptures. If you see a Thangka hanging outside in a tent or in a monastery where you have drafts from windows or butter lamps, etc., people walking by, it waves like a sculpture. It behaves like a sculpture, not like a flat painting. After all, it has so many components. It has wood, metal, painted textile, heavily brocaded textile. It has leather cords sometimes. They're all put together in a sculpture form that sometimes is at war with itself and very difficult to preserve. Most people think of Thangkas like this, that they see in many museums. Is it a Thangka if it's only the painting without its textile mounting? Is it a Thangka if it's only the textile mounting but without a painting or other iconographic panel in the middle? Usually, only the painting is in the picture for Thangka appreciation. The Thangka form is at war with itself. For example, the panel in the middle is sewn in tightly to its textile surround, and therefore changes in temperature and relative humidity cause them to react differently. If you were to have a Thangka resting flat in perfect storage, perfect low light levels, laying flat, temperature and relative humidity controlled, it would still deteriorate. It's what we used to call an object with inherent vice. In other words, the Thangka form itself is difficult to preserve because within itself it's deteriorating, and especially from traditional usage. Thangkas are three-dimensional, and well, generally this is what people think a Thangka is. And why is it like this? For example, this is from my study collection. I lend my study collection to museums and use it in workshops. This is a Thangka of a Buddha. It dates from the 1900s and was damaged in the Nepal earthquake. It was a present. It's complete Thangka form with the surround, the textile lining on the reverse, the yellow silk cover, wooden dowels top and bottom, flat ribbons that traditionally hang over the iconographic panel, which irritates a lot of scholars, cords to hold up the Thangka and hold up the cover. And did you know that the textile mounting has its own iconography? Without the textile mounting, some people consider that a painting alone is not a full Thangka. Why is the Thangka in that form? Because traditionally it traveled with the monasteries and with people on yaks through the Himalayas. In other words, everything had to be rolled up and put on the back of yaks, especially when great teachers traveled from valley to valley to offer Buddhist teachings. This is a gar, which is a Buddhist teaching tent, and they still happen today. And everything traveled on the yaks, including the Thangkas, the texts, the tent, the robes, food, everything. That's why Thangka is traditionally rolled up. Here is a modern gar, or traditional meeting where you have many people coming to hear teachings by a great teacher. And they're unrolling the Thangkas and hanging them up and then rolling them again. So Thangkas are receiving the same treatment as they did in the tradition centuries ago. This causes splits in the support. By the way, the secretion you see is from blessing substances. It's not dirt. And it causes great damage to the painting itself. This is a raking light image of what a traditional Thangka looks like, because the hand-ground pigments give it a very three-dimensional quality. It's not flat like a poster. Therefore, you could imagine when this is rolled and unrolled, it's going to be damaged. You could see the lines of damage already from rolling. Traditionally, Thangkas were stored, rolled up, and stacked on each other. This causes immense damage, and this traditional caretaker is gripping it in the center, also pinching the painting. Not everyone can afford this perfect storage. This is at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. the perfect Thangka storage. You can see here, Thangkas have their own drawer. They're locked up, the light is kept out, no pests, everything's perfect, the security is perfect. This would be ideal. But not only can most museums not afford this, but most monasteries definitely cannot. So they're very simple and inexpensive ways to create storage flat for Thangkas. So you don't have to roll them. After all, when people want to roll Thangkas, I ask them, where is your yak? Do you have to travel with it on the back of a yak? That's my introduction to the Thangka form. And now it's time for your Thangka questions. I'm very excited about this. The first question. I love this image. Thank you for sending it of you working. It would be great if you could elaborate on the significance of the blessings of the Thangkas. I also wanted to know whether the blessing marks, if present, are conserved as well. Do they need conservation? How is its authenticity preserved? Well, it's not just Thangkas that are empowered. Statues and even the stupa or chochen is empowered. You can see heaps of texts being put inside for an empowerment blessing. Plus, sometimes old Thangkas, because they're imbued with blessings, are put inside stupas as well. In answer to your question, empowerment, how does a Thangka get empowered to represent the energy of its deities? If there's no inscription, can you tell if it was ever blessed? Is a newer Thangka more blessed than an older Thangka if it was blessed by a great teacher? If your conservation treatment obscures the blessing syllables or symbols, does that affect the strength of the blessing? Are Thangkas still blessed if they have been in a museum for a century, for example, rolled up in storage? What about the blessings substances? This is a Thangka that has blessing substances. The chopan, or shrine offerer, might flick blessing substances towards the shrine, and the Thangka also. And this is, accretions are part of the history of the object, whereas these dots are fly specks. You know, there was a conservator who goes around and gives out little wooden sticks that are used for barbecues. And he teaches monks and nuns to gouge out the fly specks and the traditional blessing substances to make it look clean, but actually you're just causing a lot of damage and removing history of the object. This Thangka is not dirty. The darkness you see is from offering substances, butter, lamp smoke, and incense grit. It is truly impossible to remove because there's no varnish layer like in Western paintings. You'd have to definitely create deep change and disturbance and perhaps damage to Thangkas to make it look new and clean. Please leave it as it is. This is a blessed Thangka, totally blessed by hand and footprints of a master teacher through the centuries, and someone cleaned it. And you can see that it did not have a very good result. If you're asking about the blessing syllables on the back, this transmitted light image of this painting. By the way, I'm not brushing it with a brush. I didn't want to point because it's not polite. So I use the brush to indicate where the blessing syllables are. This transmitted light image shows you the blessing syllables, the head, the heart, and the body. Om Ahum, plus handprints and signature. Here is the master teacher, the 16th Karmapa, doing his handprints and signature on the back of it. You know, scholars are also very interested in the blessings. For example, these scholars are looking at the inscription on the back to see whose handprints as empowerment is there. Some Buddhists believe that the back, which has the empowerment, is actually more valuable due to the blessings than the front, which has the iconography. That's how important the empowerment is. So you have a great question. This is a genuine empowerment. And this makes me very sad because this is a fake. It's a fake Thangka here I'm pointing to because it was sold as old, but it's new. That's what a fake is. And someone put a fake handprint empowerment, and the syllables are in the wrong place. It's very disrespectful. There are thangkas with elaborate textural inscriptions on the reverse and with iconographic labels on the front. Thangkas and text go together. Centuries ago, not many people read. So in order to understand what they were to visualize in their meditation practice, they had a picture of the text. Many thangkas have inscriptions and empowerment as text on the back. Often, due to the rolling and unrolling and storage, it gets damaged. And in order to have it translated, we use apps on our phone for post-capture light enhancement. The blessings on the back are significant. However, if you don't see a blessing, it does not mean that it was not blessed. A great teacher might have gone by and flicked rice or just said a prayer, and it's equally blessed. Again, post-capture app on the phone to bring up inscriptions front and back and empowerments that are no longer visible. I have concern with modern teachers to write their empowerments. They're using whatever ballpoint pen or marker that somebody hands them. This is from a great artist and meditation master, Kamtrul Rinpoche, in 1970. He used a ballpoint pen for his signing and his date, which he rarely did, to bless a thangka. This is a rare example. And by now it's all faded because the ballpoint pen faded. These are not empowerment syllables. They're just marks on the thangka that show you perhaps the collector's mark or where in the temple it was to hang. Custom stamps. So thank you for that question. Next question. How should the light be placed so that the thangka is visible and it's not even damaged by the light? Very good question. Let's refer to our risk assessment chapter. Risks to thangkas. Light is a big one. Bright sunlight can equal 30,000 lux, but dyes and textiles start to fade at 50 lux. Okay, thangkas look pretty good, some of the old ones, because in previous centuries in older monasteries, windows were tiny and electric lighting was just not available or even invented centuries ago, so that the overall light exposure was significantly lower than it can be now. Rooms were darker. Museums work with this very need for exhibition lighting to keep light levels low as 50 lux. So what they do is that the entrance to the room is darker so that your eyes slowly adjust. And with a lower level of illumination, you can see quite well, like in old monasteries. Just have to adjust. So if you want to prevent light levels to your thangka, in answer to your question, filter the sun from the outside, control your lighting in the inside. Choose your light bulbs carefully and turn off the lights when no one is there. Modulate the light coming through the windows. Replace any old tube lights with LED lights. It's very simple. With light, as with other risks to thangkas, prevention is the best cure. Here are some examples of probably what you're asking me about. High light levels for thangkas. This is a textile thangka in India. Again, you can imagine how much damage this is causing with the daylight. 30,000 lux. This is a thangka exhibit in a temple. And you can see that these spotlights, which are fluorescent spotlights, are so bright and they're burning a visual hole in the picture so the people can barely even see the center of it and causing great fading and other damage. This type of lighting is not necessary. This is from a museum in India. They've since changed it, where they had for decades a fluorescent tube on top of this thangka in display, and the fine cover deteriorated. This is a temple in Hong Kong where the light comes in from the outside and there's fluorescent lights on top, and a temple in Bhutan where fluorescent lights on top and the sunlight's coming in below. What can we do? It's simple. LED and also sun filtering screens are easily available. They cut out the intensity and the UV content of the daylight. This is the temple that's using them. Here's an example. You can hardly see them in the windows. This is the screen down and this is the window. It cuts out the UV and reduces intensity to protect your thangkas. In the nunnery where they didn't have those, the nuns sewed this traditional cloth cover. Very successful, thank you. As scientists, we measure the light for thangkas. We measure the UV content, the intensity, and the light patterns through the day and night. You can do this. Light is our friend as conservators because we use it with safety to show us more about the objects we're examining. This is different types of light. Plain light, raking light, we use transmitted. And this is that light apps to show us things in damage and condition we might not see. It's amazing. This is plain light. This is examination from Thangka I was doing in Sweden. And this is raking light from the side. This looks in good condition, but you can see the true condition that's revealed by light. So we can use light as conservators, as our friend, to give us information about thangkas. So your question about light was very good. Thank you. Next question. Is the cover of the thangka, if the cover of the thangka is lost, does it affect the authenticity of the thangka? And the wallpaper here is a thangka cover. This tailor, and usually the tailors were men, but this is a delightful picture from Kathmandu, is sewing thangka covers. This is the cover material we use now. Because the traditional cover material, as you see in these thangkas underneath, is no longer available. It's so rare and so fragile. I have a study collection of thangka covers because when thangkas were first collected, the covers were ripped off and discarded. I collected them then. They're given to me just, from the garbage, and I collect them for study collection. And the thing is that the paintings were removed their mounting and only paintings were considered important. But now these covers are rare and significant. This is a historically important thangka, and you can see the cover has been ripped off. This is a modern thangka with a modern cover, which is very different. But this thangka here, it never did have a cover. This form of thangka mounting never had a cover at all. So just because it doesn't have one doesn't mean that it's insignificant. There are many. This is from the collection in Yale, the Beinecke Library. Very elaborate, many panels, and this is a kind of gift thangka with valances on top. Traditional thangkas are gauze weave on a very narrow loom, so they're usually sewn together and decorated with vegetable stamp dye. Vegetables are cut, dipped in different dyes and stamped on. They're often sewn together in pieces. You could see the fine gauze weave and how fragile it is. Traditional thangka, splitting. Some have woven designs. And because of the raising and lowering, traditional gauze weave thangka covers often get damaged. And that's one reason why museums and collectors used to just take them off. They also have a tooth, what's called a tooth, which means that they cling and they stick. And often you can see that this thangka cover is clinging to the painting. And if the painting is fragile, it can pull off pieces of the pigment. Pop, pop, pop. So when you're storing thangkas, please put either a fine cloth or tissue between the thangka painting and its cover. At the top, they often become damaged due to rolling and unrolling. And if there's any water damage, there is transfer of dye. There have been attempts to conserve thangka covers like this. And it looks good from the front. Combination, this person used a combination of adhesive and sewing. And the reason is because it's raised, when it's raised traditionally, then it's a lot of stress on the fabric. You can see that, how an old fragile Thangka cover would suffer from this, but yet it's very traditional and looks beautifully when it's raised. Next question. Which one of the two, an all textile Thangka or Thangka with painting on paper, is more difficult to preserve? Beautiful picture, thank you. Actually, a Thangka is a sculpture, and preservation of the entire sculpture, Thangka sculpture, first of all, is preservation to prevent future damage and then stabilize any damage. In museums where you have a vast conservation staff, you can have a painting conservator working on one part of it, a textile conservator working on another. I have worked on the whole Thangka sculpture from the beginning since 1970, and therefore you get a balanced preservation effect. Copying is traditional. So if you're asking which is more difficult to work on, the painting, which is on cloth, not paper, or the textile, it really depends on the technique, the methods and materials they were made from. This is an older Thangka support and painting method, older Thangka textile surround, and this is newer. And perhaps you'd have to use different stabilization methods for them because of methods and materials. Again, older and deteriorating in a certain way from traditional use and damage, and newer and deteriorating as we see from light damage. So you'd have to really do a lot of research into the methods and materials first, and then decide what stabilization methods you use. It's not that it's easier to work on the painting than the mounting or vice versa. Every Thangka sculpture is different. And Thangka sculptures are changing. So you asked about paper, but this is a plastic iconographic panel. This is printed on plastic substrate. Traditional textile around it, plastic substrate center. And this, which my favorite nuns still call a Thangka, is totally printed on kind of polyester flocking. And this is considered a Thangka. So you would have to preserve this plastic, textile, totally plastic. And then we're getting into the world of popularity of digital Thangkas. On Facebook, there's digital Thangka groups, and they do amazing things with digital Thangkas. And here is a digital Thangka. Would you preserve it online? Would you preserve it digitally? If it's printed and put within a traditional surround, you'd have to preserve the substrate it was printed on. So it's a complicated question, preservation of the Thangka sculpture. Thank you for asking. And then you'll want to know if something newer is spiritually less significant when you're working on it. And you'll also want to know, as a conservator, well, look at this painting. It's framed as paper, and you asked about paper probably because it looks like paper objects are framed. This is in a museum without the full Thangka form. It's actually painted on cloth. Complicated and difficult is the preservation of large textile Thangkas. Very complicated. You can see this is in use. And that's because if you look on the reverse of a textile Thangka, it's so complicated in its construction. I would say this would be a real challenge for you. So thank you for asking that question. Next question. And we're running out of time, and I want some questions from our audience today. So I'll go a little faster. Gemstones and the benefits of owning a Thangka, according to Buddhism. I think to the second question, it's not so much that you would own it, that you would go buy it and then own it. It's more that it's there for you to be inspired by. Perhaps the blessings that it was imbued with by a great teacher, perhaps with the iconography to inspire your meditation practice. The idea of owning is kind of out of the tradition. Some great teachers have told me that if they're acquiring a Thangka, they prefer that they give a gift and then the Thangka is given to them back as a gift. It's not a direct purchase. So it's not so much owning. After all, hopefully the Thangka will last much longer than we do and go into further generations. It's there to inspire us and offer the seed of merit to those who see it. It's not about possession. In terms of gems, traditional Thangkas themselves are actually made from gemstones. These are beautiful minerals from the Himalayas. We've done a lot of research on which gemstones or minerals are used in the creation of traditional Thangkas. We've identified them. And gems themselves are all over Thangka paintings. Talking about gems, these are cabochon cut gems. In other words, they're not made faceted like you might have a diamond ring faceted. This is a traditional type of gemstone preparation offered everywhere on Thangkas at the bottom. This is a monastery during a period of high practice, and you can see that over the Thangkas is hung this textile applique made with many, many small gems. This is a whole screen of gems, gem offerings for this time of year. Real gems are used on Thangkas. I'd like to draw the distinction between a real gem stone that is sewn on a Thangka, and usually it's so heavy that it creates tearing in the substrate, in the Thangka support, the silk support. And also any gemstones that are used as Thangka pigments. I did ask a traditional painter who said that some painters put ground up gemstones and medicine into their traditional Thangka pigments. Others don't. It depends on the artist. So that's one answer. I've worked on Thangka textile Thangkas where the weight of the gemstones, pearls, corals, amethyst is so heavy that the Thangka support cannot bear it. Next question. How can the authenticity of a Thangka painting be maintained during the process of conservation? Again, you're preserving Thangkas with safe storage, handling, and display. Please just stabilize. Don't do drastic measures for cleaning or repainting. Don't take away, evidence of historic blessing. It's a sacred art form. Thangkas aren't dirty and cannot be cleaned. Please, if you want a new looking Thangka, have one painted. I've worked with monks and nuns to preserve Thangkas, to preserve the authenticity, according to your question, of the most precious Thangkas in their own monasteries, from their own monasteries. This is very rare, precious Thangka. It's all painted. The textile is even painted. And I'm working with nuns to preserve it. This is a working Thangka. It's used in the nunnery. It's used to be there for certain lunar calendar events. It's used as an example of iconography, Avalokiteshvara, for the nuns to be inspired by, and it's highly blessed. They're not trying to make it look new. They want it to be used. Like when you're in your car, you want to be able to start it and go from here to there. When you have a blessed Thangka, it has to be in usable condition so that you can actually use it to serve its function within your monastery and nunnery. This is not a museum. We went from this to this. We work together in monasteries and nunneries for preservation so that we make the Thangkas back in working order. Another authenticity is when you have to have a replacement part, please make it look authentic. If it's been removed and you need to replace it, like this top, you can create authenticity with a label for the viewers that this was added. In painting and consolidation, Well, you have to be really careful. I'm consolidating here. And as far as in painting this historic, valuable Thangka of Padmasambhava, that's up to discussion. I really like to keep it to a minimum. I use conservation colors that are reversible. Authenticity. Next question, and I am keeping an eye on the time. Matthew, I really like this question, significance of Thangkas. But Matthew, I'm hoping in this picture you're doing a yoga move and that you're not actually sitting on the ledge in this historic cave. Actually, your question is really complicated, and I would love to talk with you about this for hours and hours. The word significance is a value judgment, and conservators are told to not use value judgment words. For example, we're trained to approach every Thangka as a great masterpiece and every work of art as unique, so that we don't say this is worth more financially, so I'm going to give it more time. But then again, the person that's paying you to do the work, your funder, might say, this is a hugely valuable Thangka, and we're going to hire you for a year to stabilize it. Whereas this is modern and it doesn't need much work. It's sometimes up to the owner, museum or monastery, the significance. In terms of a conservator, please be careful of your use of significance, because so many people feel that the word significance is financial significance, and that has no place in conservation. To understand significance, you have to understand the methods of material of how something is made. For example, there's iconographic significance, and you may lose elements of iconography due to damage. But also it has to do with significance in terms of how it's made due to where it was made. And there are different techniques through the centuries. And in one part of the Silk Route, from another part of the Silk Route, you'd have different Thangka techniques depending on where the painter was trained. We do a lot of analysis about this. This is, for example, from eastern part of the Silk Route, and you could see it has a significance due to the age and the iconographical content. It has a significance due to the methods and materials also, and that's so important for planning your preservation treatment. Have to know what things are made from, especially contemporary. Significance is there in the offering substances. Significance is there in the details that you may not be able to see with your eye, and that's why we use different lighting and post-capture apps on our phones that show us so much about details of methods in manufacture and also iconography that you cannot see. So significance can be revealed by use of conservation observation. Significance about religion, okay. Some Thangkas are not even Buddhist. They're of the Bön religion, which is quite important. This is not a Buddhist Thangka, it's a Bön Thangka. That's significant. And this is a significant Thangka. It's from the Sven Hedin collection because it's so rare. It's about 10 feet and it's all silk. So few silk Thangkas have lasted centuries. That's significant due to its rarity. Thank you for your question of significance. Significance, and this is me in a museum, not a monastery. We could have a discussion about Thangkas, their significance in museums. I know we're out of time, so we'll have one last question, and then I'd love questions from the live audience. This is her question. In the video, and that's the complete Thangka conservation video, which you can have a link to, I observed someone wrapping their Thangka painting in plastic sheet, keeping in mind the natural environment. Is there a sustainable way to preserve Thangka paintings where plastics are not used? What a great question. The thing is that I'd say plastics, okay, are bad for the environment, but plastics can also be terrible for the Thangkas. Someone decided, for example, to keep the dust off paintings, wall and Thangkas, using plastic sheeting. When it gets warm during the day, moist air becomes trapped behind the plastic. Then when it gets could not contain the moisture anymore, temperature and relative humidity, because cold air cannot hold as much moisture as warm air, and therefore moisture starts condensing onto the painting, causing damage from the plastic cover. This can create a lot of mold, and it makes the painting look like water has been poured on it, which in fact it has. So you don't want to trap air next to your vulnerable treasures when you know there'll be changes in temperature and relative humidity, because that creates condensation, either in framing or wrapping with plastic. This is covered in our risk assessment chapter in the resource. Here you have mold behind the plastic glazing in this Thangka framing technique. You could see the mold growing. This nunnery has plastic over its paintings. It's there to prevent monsoon damage, but actually it creates more damage from condensation and mold growth. Behind her, you could see that the beautiful wall painting is there, but its iconographical features are not even visible. I really don't recommend the use of plastic, either on wall paintings or on Thangkas. And this is very common. People feel they are preventing damage to their Thangka during the monsoon, but actually you're getting a lot of condensation and mold growth inside. It's really not recommended. And I know the question was about sustainability, but I'm actually very concerned about the use of plastics on Thangkas as it creates damage. This entire statue is wrapped in plastic, and that would be a lot of plastic for the landfill, indeed. That's to keep it dry, and this is right before it was consecrated, also to keep it from people's view, because it had to be blessed and consecrated in a big offering ceremony. And so it was wrapped in plastic. I do understand your concern, and science is developing new substances that are biodegradable that can replace plastic in these uses. And hopefully, for example, like Tyvek, they can allow some exchange of air so that you don't get condensation. And also, hopefully, that they won't end up in the landfill, which is your concern, and that they will biodegrade. So it's a very good question, and it has brought up other uses of plastic which are damaging to our Thangkas. As a matter of fact, new Thangka forms are in fact plastic themselves. And so will this calendar Thangka end up in the landfill after its date is gone? You find these all over the Himalayan region, calendar Thangkas. And next year, what will happen to it? It's entirely made of plastic. And again, this is a traditional Thangka, but new Thangkas have their iconographic panel printed on plastic substrates. There, I've kept to our time. I so appreciate the questions of the students. Thank you. And if I haven't had time to fully answer your questions, students, please get in touch with me after. I'd be delighted to Zoom personally with you, and we could talk about your questions further. And now, for the other guests on this Zoom live today who haven't had a chance to send me their questions, I'm here for your questions. And for those that will be watching this presentation in the future in video, I also be very interested in hearing your questions, and we could have a Zoom and discuss your Thangka preservation questions.
Definitely.
Again, thank you.
So we've got Feroza ma'am online. Feroza ma'am, you have unmuted yourself. You can go ahead with the questions.
I have unmuted myself. It's been a fascinating lecture, and we found so many points of interest. And I know that you're sitting in Nova Scotia in Canada. It's morning time for you. And when did you begin this interest in Thangkas? what drove you or attracted you to Thangkas? If you could let us, the audience, know what was the motivation behind that. My second question, which I will ask right now, is that when you went into the monasteries, the monks and the nuns, you were teaching them, but was there any teaching from them to you? And how did they receive that? And thank you so much. Many of us here who are on the webinar today have been familiar with your work, and some of us have not. But I was delighted to read up, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you also worked and studied under a very beloved figure who has visited us in Bombay for years and years and years, unfortunately not with us today. But I definitely would like to acknowledge Professor Walter Spink, who spent so many summers with us. It's unbelievable, about 45 summers, I believe, or more with his students. So I will just end here and with my two questions, and thank you in advance. Thank you.
Thank you, Feroza. Professor Walter Spink was one of my main mentors. I actually studied Buddhist iconography and have a master's in Asian art history under Professor Spink. And we decided that I would not go on for a PhD and become an art historian, since I had already begun conservation research in monasteries previous to that. And we were in touch through the years, and I would send him images of monasteries I was working in, and he'd send me questions. And he said, shortly before he died, that of all his graduate students, I was the one that was actually making a difference, in that I was helping to preserve the materiality of what other people are just writing about. And I didn't take that as a personal compliment. I took it as gratitude towards Professor Spink for encouraging me in conservation. So thank you for bringing him up. Now, your next question. So really, Professor Spink is also very important. Thanks. The next question, I don't work and teach really in monasteries. I hope I didn't express it that way. I'm a guest in monasteries. I'm invited by the head teacher of the lineage. I wouldn't be in there unless I were invited in. And I work with respect as a Buddhist, and I work with the monks and nuns. I've never put myself in a superior or teaching position. We work together. I am always researching and learning as much about traditional methods and materials as they are about current science. It is totally collaborative. We're working together. So I would never presume to be called a teacher in a monastery. I am grateful to be invited to work in monasteries, and we are working together. And many times I've had the honor of having the opportunity to be there for Buddhist teachings while I'm there, working in preservation also. So I hope that clears that up. I'm a guest in monasteries, and I work with, and I totally respect what goes on there in traditions. Now, how did I get interested in all this? Jason had a museum behind him in his screen. I grew up in New York City, and our school class, when I was age 7, we went around to museums. We took the subway, and we went to museums. We went to the Met, we went to the Museum of New York, and my favorite, the Museum of Natural History in New York, which is now one of my clients. And at age 7, I saw my first Thangka and never forgot it. Then I began to meditate. And later in life, as a conservator, I got to work on that very Thangka that I saw when I was 7, because it was having problems. And the museum is one of my clients. So I believe in education, museum education for children, museum outreach to school classes, because it is at a young age that children learn about preservation. They learn about material culture, their own and others. Museum education is so important, and I'm an example of it.
I have a question for you, if I could go ahead.
Yes.
So when you're looking at the material and technology of a Thangka, how did you identify the chemical makeup of the pigments? Was it via an XRF machine or something else?
Yes, I've been researching with other scholars and scientists the composition of Thangka pigments since 1970. And I actually was trained as a Thangka painter. And one of my masters had pigments he brought with him from the Himalayas. And at the time, that was in, let's see, I started researching pigments in 1970. And then in 1976, I was training in Thangka painting and we were researching then. And now I have colleagues who are conservation scientists who have all the toys. And so the research we're doing involves the generosity of my colleagues who are conservation scientists who have the tool you talked about and other tools that are going to be developed. And we've done quite a bit of publishing on scientific research. And again, I'm very grateful to my colleagues who are conservation scientists, for example, Jennifer Mass.
Right. Firoza ma'am, now I'll be calling Anita ma'am to
I have one
take
more
on. Oh,
question.
okay. Okay. Okay.
I presume we're in your home, Anne. I hope we're not intruding, but I am intrigued about the Thangkas that are hanging in your home. Were they something we saw during the presentation or something else? Yes, much better. What are those three?
Thank you. I have a Thangka study collection, but I'm not a collector. I use them for instruction. In other words, hands-on for monks and nuns, hands-on for conservation technicians and scientists. But I do pay attention as Buddhist to the iconography. So because of the world pandemic, the Thangkas you see behind me, and this is my writing room because I'm still writing the preservation resource for monks and nuns. These are medicine Buddha Thangkas. In other words, that's the traditional medicine Buddha. Both of these Thangkas are contemporary, painted with traditional ground pigments, but the contemporary form of them. They're in contemporary textile mountings, which are based on traditional. And I have them here because they're appropriate in terms of iconography for the pandemic situation. But I also have these medicine Buddha Thangkas hanging here because they are contemporary, and therefore the beautiful Nova Scotia freezing cold light that's coming through my window. We did have a little bit of summer, but now it's getting cold, but I love daylight. So the daylight that's flooding through my window, illuminating me and the Thangkas will definitely cause them some damage. So that's therefore I don't have my 1600, 1700 highly damaged, fragile Thangkas hanging from my study collection in my writing room. This is a calculated risk for slight damage to these contemporary medicine Buddha Thangkas. And so that's why, another reason that these are the Thangkas that are hanging here in my writing room from which we are talking. And again, the iconography is appropriate for the pandemic, and also they're pretty sturdy. So that's why I think that's a great question. Thank you so much. One was painted in Bhutan, and one was painted in Dharamshala, both by traditional painters and the textiles sewn by traditionally trained tailors.
Thank you.
Great.
So I now call upon Dr. Anita Rane Guthare, the head of the Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology, to take on a few questions which are in the chat box and to give the vote thanks. Dr. Anita?
Thank you, Jason. My video is off, but I can ask a question over here. What is the standard material feature fabric which they have used in the paintings? This was a question asked by Miral Gara. So, Dr. Ann, can you just tell us about it?
Yes, certainly. Traditionally, they were painted on cotton. The cotton was hand woven in the past on narrow looms. So therefore, most traditional Thangkas have big seam. They're seamed together. The support is cotton that is seamed together. And the seam is finished so well, both in its creation of the support, the water support, but also with the application of the ground that you don't even notice them. So therefore, the cotton support seamed together, you can see more about the support from the reverse. When I look at a Thangka, I examine it from the reverse first. I see about the condition of the support, how many seams it has in it, if it is indeed cotton, because there are, and these are the exceptions, some Thangka with silk supports. Now, we're not talking about all textile Thangkas like we saw the huge one, which are appliqué. We're talking about traditional ones. You're talking about the panel of iconography. And yes, some are painted on silk. And these are so rare. In answer to one of the questions, I showed a silk support Thangka and was significant due to the fact it still exists because it was kept in storage for so long. That's the Sven Hedin collection in Sweden. Very, very rare that a silk support Thangka would last because the silk deteriorates. It's so fragile. So yes, there are silk support Thangkas. And I've seen just a few leather supports, but those are very provincial. So cotton, cotton, cotton for support, rare that you would see silk because they simply don't last. But they have an entire different aesthetic. And sometimes the silk ones are very, very beautiful. And then very, very rare leather. These days, of course, you have plastic and digital and paper. Yes, that's a very good question. Now, some people feel that it's not cotton because of regional styles. For example, in the eastern part of the Silk Road, you might have a Thangka support that's very, very finely woven. It almost looks like silk, but it's not. It's very fine. The support is fine. The ground on top is fine. The paint layer is fine. So some people feel those are actually not cotton, but they are. Whereas more central on the Silk Road, perhaps the style was to have a coarser weave, a stronger weave of the support, and still perhaps on the narrow loom and seam together. And therefore, that's more recognizable as cotton, even under the ground layers. And the reason, therefore, some people feel that they're painted on silk, it has to do with the regional style where the support is so finely woven and thus very fragile. And that's from the eastern region of the Himalayas.
Well, thank you, Anna. It was a very exciting lecture, mainly because uh, we had taken students from the Museum Society of Mumbai as well as uh, AIC, that's Department of Ancient Indian Culture, to Dharamshala, Bhutan, and Sikkim to the workshops of Thangka. And one more thing really fascinated me was that you are a student of Dr. Walter Spink. He was also my teacher. And the medicinal Buddha, which you showed behind, he had shown us the only image of the medicinal Buddha right in Bombay, Mumbai at Kanheri Caves. So I have, you can say, soft feelings. We call him as Vaishakcha Guru over here. And so thank you very much for an exciting lecture on the conservation of Thangkas over here. And I think my students have really asked, they have really benefited from this. We have it as a part of a syllabus also. And I'm glad our students have really enjoyed it. So on behalf of the Museum Society of Bombay, Mumbai, the Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology, St. Xavier's College, and the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya, I thank Ann Shaftel for a fantastic lecture.